And we are live. Heidi, thank you so much for coming here.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor.
Well, of course. I mean, you and I met a while ago, and we actually tried to make this podcast happen, and we sat down, we had a beautiful conversation, and then God interfered or something, and just it deleted all the sound. We had to meet happily. I got to see you again and have this conversation with you, and I'm honored.
Thank you. And yeah, stuff like that. I think we've all had experiences where something goes wrong technically, and that's, and
it's always frustrating, isn't it? It's always this kind of challenge where you do something, you go out to the field, if it's photography or a podcast like this, and just the technical aspect of it.
Well, I think it's also today with the technology, even though it's given us so much, on the other hand, we have so much more to carry and so much more to worry about because we have so many more things to keep charged, so many more cables, and every few months, whatever we're using, it's
irrelevant. You have to change it all up.
Exactly.
The struggles of the modern photographers. But for people at home, let's start from the beginning. For the people at home, Heidi is an amazing war photographer, journalist, photographer, and a general amazing person by herself.
I don't really like being called a war photographer.
So how would you call it? How about, let's do this. How about you introduce yourself for the people at home?
Okay. My name is Heidi Levine. I'm an American photographer whose work does concentrate a lot on conflict and war, and the struggles of humanity, and the impact actually on civilians especially.
I think it's one of those things that when I heard the kind of occupation you do, maybe I'm wrong to call it war photography or journalist photography, but I guess working around conflict areas and conflict stories, I was quite taken by three variables of it. Okay. First of all, the fact that anybody would willingly go to these places. Those are very scary places. You think about what I do, which is travel photography, documentary photography. Well, there is a lot of sense of adventure or a sense of even danger. You go to extreme climates, or you go to cultures or places who might not be necessarily safe. Doing the kind of work you do is very conflict oriented. You're literally going to the belly of the beast. You're going to those places that most of us won't want to get near in, and you have to go straight in to get stories, to get your work done. And the other thing I really liked about your work was that while I was expecting to see, only big explosions, horrors, there is that in your portfolio, but a lot of your work is very personal and a very humane work. And it's a very refreshing view of how it's been approached.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do regard my work as intimate. At least I try to be. I think it's actually sometimes even harder to go and spend the night with a family that's lost family members or suffered horrific injuries. It's even sometimes more difficult than actually being in the battlefield.
It's quite challenging. It's the one thing I kept recurring. But people at home who, if people at home haven't seen yet the blog post itself, you can see that most of your work has been concentrated in the Middle East.
Right.
A lot of it was done in Gaza, but other places as well.
Well, I've been covering Gaza since 1983. And
1983. That's before I was born.
And believe it or not, I mean, I'm not sure if you know this, but at that time, Israelis were actually going to Gaza and having lunch in Gaza. There was maybe like one soldier. There wasn't at the checkpoint.
It was more laid back then, when you first started, in a sense.
Well, it wasn't that it was just more laid back. It wasn't as separated.
Following on that exactly is, I think, one of the things I always found amazing, and or I would love to hear your opinion about, is that you go to these places in the Middle East, or if it's Gaza or any other place where religion or culture has a lot to do with separation. Right. Men and women, or this is where men can go, women can't, and so on. And as a female photographer yourself, which is a whole thing by itself, how do you get to a point where in these kind of places women are denied access for certain things, how do you get to a place where you can actually do your work?
Well, sometimes you have to negotiate. Sometimes you have to to live with the fact that no is a no. It's happened to me even at the Western Wall that I couldn't photograph a pope, a papal visit to the Western Wall because I'm a woman. In Gaza, I often can't be together with my male colleagues inside a mosque because of my gender.
Just denied altogether. There's like, you want to, that when you go and work on an article, on an assignment as a press photographer, just the fact that you are from the press doesn't give you any privileges or allows you to go into places where you wouldn't be able otherwise?
Sometimes, yes. I mean, as I said, like, no is never always no. It can and often does upset a lot of people. During the war in 2014, I was photographing 2 young brothers that were killed together, and I was photographing their funeral. And actually, I saw the father just walking down the street, holding one of his sons, and then alternating, handing the body of one child to a family member and taking the body of the other. And I followed them into the mosque, and I knew that it was going to upset people that I was there. And I actually ran out of the car. I mean, nothing was ever scheduled. I mean, you never know when anything is happening, especially during a conflict. And people were just taking the bodies from the morgues and bringing them to burial as quickly as they could, because they didn't want that. They couldn't bury their dead. And so I ran out of the car without my headscarf. And so when I ended up inside the mosque, I knew the men weren't happy that I was there, and I just grabbed a curtain and threw it on my head, and I had to like really negotiate. And luckily I have a wonderful driver and assistant, Ashraf, who's been working with me for over a decade. So I mean, he's really amazing. I would never be able to do what I have done without him. And for a few minutes I was allowed to stand where the other male photographers were and photograph. I was limited in time. I wasn't given the same amount of time as they were, but they understood, and we made them understand that it was really important for me to be there. To
share that story, to work on it.
Yes.
But in general, you just tell those stories, and those are horrific scenes. This is something that most people, men, women alike, would take hard time to cope with. Mm-hmm. I mean, just that story of seeing a father walking the street with the corpse.
I think it was even actually harder than it was so surreal. I mean, you see people walking down the street, you just don't expect to see that someone's just walking down the street holding in their arms not just one child, but 2 that are dead. And it is really hard. I mean, you almost, people often ask me if I get used to the situations that I document. Does it become easier? Am I immune to it emotionally? And to be honest, I find that it's getting harder and harder to emotionally
cope with it
and process.
You say like a lot of people would expect you, in order to stay in that line of work you have, that you'll become more and more cynical about it, more practical. But what you say, based on your experience, as time passes, you become more and more connected to it, affected by it.
Yeah. Because, if we look at our history, we're about to close the year 2019, right? And who would ever imagine that our world is so full of wars and conflict and people leaving their homes and drowning in the seas to get to have a better life. And so I think for me, it's just so important to be able to share these stories.
I don't know how even to say it, because I think based on the images I saw from your work and the stories I heard you speak back in that event we met, and since then when we had the opportunity to meet and talk, it seems like you went through a lot of hassles, a lot of pain, a lot of fear to be able to tell these stories. And I think what you're basically showing here is that you're not doing the kind of work you do now because it's profitable, because it's something you can
Not
do.
at all.
Profitable to release.
I don't think we know.
Yeah, I'm saying, but in many ways, I think the reason you do these stories and this work is because it's important for you.
It is important.
And you seem very invested. I remember you, if you will have to tell that story again, I think people at home would be very interested. But I think one of the recurring segments I noticed when we were talking is that a lot of times you go to these depths, those just abyss of, death and war and hate and suffering. And then when you come back to, let's call it the safe zone, but go back home, you carry it with you.
Right.
And this contrast between, yesterday I was in a war zone and today I'm in a coffee shop, ordering some coffee and coffee.
But you couldn't even be in the war zone in Gaza and be in a coffee shop or be photographing clashes on the border and then come back to your hotel and there are 6 weddings going on in the same street.
Kind of life goes on at the same time.
Yes.
That's a lot of contrast to bear, especially if you say you're so affected by it, which I would assume most war photographers would be. I seriously doubt that any conflict photographer at a certain point would just get cynical, because once you're cynical to your subject matter,
I think if anyone's showing any kind of behavior like that, they're just trying to cover up.
But how do you cope with it? Because it sounds like something that has a toll on your life. How do you basically keep going and not drown in it?
Well, I guess, one of the first questions people ask me is whether or not I've been wounded. And I've been very, very lucky. Knock on
wood.
On Formica.
On fake wood, yeah.
That I haven't, or at least not seriously. But for sure, I've been emotionally scarred. I don't think anybody who does this kind of work, including doctors or NGO workers or first responders, cannot be affected by it. I mean, we're human beings. We're not machines. And I think what drives us to do this kind of work is that, we do feel a connection to the people. And my goal is to make people understand that we're not really so different from someone that lives in Bangladesh or someone that lives in Gaza. I mean, I believe that we all are born with the same needs. We want to have a healthy and successful life. We want our children to grow up in peace. We want our children to have the opportunity for education and the opportunity at the freedom to move, and which many people don't have.
We're all human. That's
Exactly.
basically the end of it, isn't it? And it's amazing because, when you talk about photography as a tool to reach out and connect with people, I think one of the biggest commonalities you find with extremely different fields of photography, if we're talking about fashion photography, travel photography, or conflict photography, or journalism, at the end of the day, you're always working with people. And I think it's a recurring segment because, when a photographer talks about how he works in the studio with a professional model, how she's embarrassed or she's not, so she's insecure, this, powerful, beautiful model. And then at the same time, when I work with any person I'm working with, if it's an eagle hunter in Mongolia or they're always very, very much human. It's something that you really relate to.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's interesting to hear, for especially people at home, I would assume that even though you go to this extreme length, that's always the focus. It's never about politics. It's usually about how can I tell this story and how can I make this person or help this person reach out.
I mean, who would ever dream that I would spend the night in Gaza, sleeping next to a woman who lost both her legs? It's Ramadan. It's after the breakfast time, and all the women in the family come over and they want to make banana curls with my curls. I mean, people are women. We're women. We are connected by all these. We have children, and we just have this connection that's
real.
That's real and amazing, and it doesn't matter if we don't speak the exact same language or if we're living in a different culture. I mean, there's just so many things that bond us together.
In your work, do you notice that using the images, using the stories you gathered, that people got it? Because I think one of the most frustrating things for somebody who's traveled and seen these firsthand, who've been there, who actually can say, this and this happened, not in terms of a news report, but I've seen people who want out, who just want to live. Do you see that through your work or through the encounters you have, whether that be with magazine editors or individuals when you do speaking engagements, that you got through to somebody that has an effect?
I do. But of course, I always wish that people would read more or listen to the news more. I mean, I think everyone can be guilty at some point in their life of kind of like just being concerned about themselves and not really opening up. I mean, aren't making enough effort to find out what else is going on around them.
To be updated, to be...
Yes, exactly.
And you seem to be very invested in it. It seems to be something that's always going on in your life. I remember we sat down for coffee, I think 3 days ago, and you were just updated with every new change, everything that's happening in the world arena, especially around your occupation. And I think it's something that comes from you being very much a professional, somebody who takes his work home in a sense.
For sure. I mean, I still remember my first journalism course and the professors telling us, well, and he was a journalist and he was a soldier and a correspondent during Vietnam. And he said, this is not a 9-to-5 job. If you can't live with that, or if you're looking for something that's an 8-hour-a-day job, just leave my class. There is not really any overtime in this profession. I mean, there is a lot of overtime, but I mean, you just have to, I mean, it's just the way it is. And you can't really turn it off. I mean, I'm lucky if I can, turn it off if I take an exercise class and just put my phone on silent, because it just becomes so much a part of you.
The habit of being on call, being ready to be called for an assignment, being called for...
Well, yes.
Wow, that's...
I mean, I actually once missed an assignment because I didn't respond to an email because I was going into a mammogram. And I thought, okay, nothing's going to happen if I respond in a half an hour to the email, right? But I lost the assignment because of that 20 minutes.
That's crazy. I mean, just being on call 24 hours, 7 days a week, that's a huge sacrifice.
Yes, but it's amazing at how a war can just suddenly erupt, especially here within, it can go from everything is quiet and then all of a sudden we find ourselves in a war.
Basically from not doing anything for a couple of weeks or months even to working day in, day out.
Yeah.
How do you... So in a sense, this whole industry, I'm completely unfamiliar with it. I mean, I'm doing completely different things. Is it that competitive, or is it basically if you're the right person in the right place, you'll be the one to be called upon? How does that business basically operates?
It is very, very competitive. I believe that because we are so much under threat now as a community, that we are sharing information and trying to help each other a lot more than perhaps in the past. Because first of all, we have the tools to do that. We have our mobiles, we have social media, we can create private WhatsApp groups to help keep each other informed. We're much more aware of safety, but we're also really under fire a lot more as journalists, because there's so many people that want to silence us and keep us from...
Yeah, you feel like
story.
Nowadays in modern times,
of course,
presses have more obstacles to go overcome. How so?
Because people are accusing us of reporting fake news when they don't like what we're reporting, or if they want to dispute it. People are a lot more concerned about their image. This is not like the Spanish Civil War where someone is not going to see their photograph in the magazine. There's a chance that people are going to see themselves on the TV set or on the front page of tomorrow's newspaper. People are a lot more afraid today of their image.
Oh, you feel like you actually were, have you had this encounter where you went to a war zone or conflict area and person was like, oh, please don't photograph me, I don't want to be on a newspaper or something like this? You think people are more aware of how a photograph can go out?
Look at the last Lebanon war. I mean, the media was accused of the outcome of the war.
Really? Well, I mean, I don't know to that extent of terms of actually blaming the media, because again, I'm not in that world, but that sounds quite interesting, because I think worldwide it got to a place where most people you would be photographing, whether that be on an assignment or a photography project or even on a fun trip that anybody at home can take tomorrow for a photography trip, most chances are that the person you're photographing is well aware of how quickly photos can spread out.
Right.
You know what? I remember I had this experience when I was mostly traveling in Asia, where I would have this iPad to show people photos I took, like this is kind of work that I do, and so on. And you would always have you go to these like deep, even in China, like small villages in the middle of nowhere, no phone reception, no nothing, and people would just pull up an iPhone and take a photo of your screen because they want the photo.
Right. No. Yeah.
And it's interesting to hear that also in that kind of moments where you're describing you would tend to work in, that people would be so hyper aware to, no, she took my image.
Also people, I mean, there's very religious cultures or even within Judaism or Islam where they don't want the image of their women out on the internet. They're afraid that their daughter will not be able to get married if her face is showing.
So, for example, you took a photo of her, well-intended, trying to help out in the world and share a story, but just because her photo was published in a certain magazine or news website, in her community, it will be harder for her to maintain her lifestyle. Or
it could be, yes. I mean,
wow.
that's why, I mean, people often will not let you, or, I mean, take example the Bedouin community. I have not succeeded.
Bedouin community. It's a group of nomadic society here in Israel.
It's really difficult for me to photograph the women. It's much easier if the men aren't home. But once the men, even a 5-year-old child can tell me no, and no is no. I mean, it's incredible, but he will have the say over his mother or grandmother. He can say no, and that's it. Even if they want to.
It's crazy. And it kind of circles back to where we started this whole conversation about how a lot of times the places that conflict happen tend to have a lot of barriers, a lot of walls, a lot of curtains. And sometimes it could be, just the cultures being private to their own stories or physical barriers, like, it's dangerous to go here, you're not allowed to go here as the press. And I think for somebody like you, which is basically the elephant in the room, who's a female conflict photographer, you have all these extra barriers in your way. But would that be fair to say that maybe sometimes you can actually use your gender to be able to get to stories that other people would miss out or notice them even?
For sure. It's an advantage, actually. For a long time in my career, I was very upset. I would fight. I thought of pulling a yentl and dressing as a man. And then I've come to terms with it.
You came... Well,
I started... I mean, I won't tell you I won't ever fight against it again, but I'm learning to appreciate it more. And see it as an advantage.
The fact that you can actually have access to other things, for example, or just in sense, I think there's a lot to do, especially in a creative profession. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what kind of art you do, whether it be painting, photography, dancing, or even within photography, it might be something relatively practical, like news photography. It is an art form. And I think a lot of time it's the shackles, it's the challenges you have that force you to be better at what you do.
Well, I think you also have to show, I mean, we were talking about this before. I mean, you have to really have empathy. You have to really respect the people that you're around. You have to also know how to deal with trauma, their trauma, your trauma. Sometimes I've been working with colleagues that will break down and cry, and I've broken down and cry. Sometimes I've put my cameras down and tried to help. There's a lot going on, but you have to care about people. You have to, even I've been working a lot on environmental stories. You have to care about the planet. I mean, you have to be a person who cares. And it's really important that people trust you.
I agree. And you know what I found amazing about everything you just said? And I think it's something definitely worth noting for people at home who would want to do, if not necessarily something similar to what you do, but kind of handle the kind of photography that you're discussing. Nothing of the things you talked about were technical.
And the last war in 2014, I was working with 2 broken cameras, and my cameras right now are not much better. And it's not really, I mean, yeah, sure, I would love, I'm hoping to get to the Mark IV and everything, but it's not at all for me about the equipment. In fact, I think really the most important piece of equipment for me is my heart.
And I think that's extremely important, because so many people get caught up in, maybe I need a different lens, maybe I need another camera, or I wonder how this image was made, what kind of technical aspects to it. But even now, when we sat down, just before we started rolling, we talked about how you were supposed to start a psychology course. And how much out of the work with people, when you deal in any kind of photography that is working with individuals, it's your ability as a person to relate. It's your ability to, if we talked about obstacles before, a lot of times the struggle won't necessarily be, you're a woman, you're not allowed into the mosque, or for example, me, I'm a big guy, so I might be scary to people. It's a lot of times a struggle of getting a person to feel comfortable around you, somebody to open up to you. And I'm not talking about in the sense of getting the trick to find the best story, is actually caring about that story and relay that to another person.
And you have to, I remember I was on my way out of Gaza some years ago, and I was at a clinic, and a father came up to me and said, "Please, I want to show you my son." And he suffered horrific burns, and he showed me, and I told my driver, "You know what? I'm not going home." And I stayed an extra 2 days, and I met the boy at home, and I photographed him, and it was really important.
So saying from just a random encounter.
I think, as we were talking earlier, this is not a 9-to-5 job. It's not always a job that you can say, I'm going to do this, that, and that, and then I'm done for the day. Like, you have to be flexible and able to
react to whatever is happening in front of you.
To react, but show respect. I mean, can you imagine if you went up to someone, came up to me, and your son had been horrifically burned by an airstrike, and I said, "Oh, okay, I gotta go." I mean, you don't do that. Maybe some people do that, but I can't do that.
And I think it's why you actually work in this occupation. And it's funny when you say that, I keep reminding myself, I keep remembering occasions when I saw, again, a whole different location and environment, which is travel photography, and you go to
I've done travel photography, and it's really hard.
It is, but you know what I found always troubling is that I saw people going out to beautiful places and beautiful people. If we go take the most classical of examples, India. People go to Varanasi, and it's a beautiful place, extremely photogenic, even ridiculously photogenic. And you see they were so excited to go ahead and photograph individuals or people who had beautiful portraits and stories, but the person photographing them was always caught up in making the best photo and never for a second thought about how would that influence the person he's photographing.
Or to take the time to have a coffee. Because,
remember their name. Take it to that extent. Sometimes it's okay. Somebody's super nervous. It's one of his first opportunities to actually do a portrait with a person. So they're very nervous and take a portrait and okay, thank you. And they go. But a lot of times you see how photographers would intentionally piss off the person they're photographing, or would be so into taking that photo when the person they're photographing after a while feels a bit uncomfortable and wish it would end. Now take that experience, which is relatively common in travel and documentary photography, and copy paste it to the conflict zone area, the places you're working in. Whatever you do as a human over there affects the situation so much, and also affect the person.
And there are times that people will say no. There are times that people will react violently. I mean, in Gaza, we can get very, very close to the families during funerals, whereas in Israel...
physically, or actually getting to know the actual family?
Well, physically.
Physically, just be physically...
Because it's very, very chaotic. Whereas a funeral in the West is more organized, and you would not have such a close interaction as we do. And people are beyond themselves. I mean, imagine. And so it's at times people are very angry and don't want you there.
So let me ask you this, as somebody who's in the field, because at the end of the day, with all much, we want to be nice and we want to be considerate and we want to be human, which I think is one of the main lessons we've learned so far from this conversation. But at the end of the day, this is your job. I mean, you're not doing this for fun. You're going out to the field, not just because you put food on the table, but that's something you were supposed to do. You're expected for certain photos. How do you deal with somebody who is, you need this image and they're not willing to? How do you cope with that?
For example, when we've covered funerals on the Israeli side and we've been told that the family doesn't want us, I would say the majority of us, we leave or we don't go.
You let it go.
Or if we're told while we're there, we leave.
So
I think that's important.
I think it's very respectful.
Yes, exactly. Because as I said earlier, what's really important is that you respect the people that you're documenting. And if somebody doesn't want you documenting their child's funeral or loved one's funeral, you have to respect that. I mean, I couldn't imagine being on the other side of my camera.
No, I think it's absolutely true, but I think there's always a conflict when it comes to it. And
I think editors, I mean, I've never had an editor like scold me because I didn't come back with a picture under those circumstances.
Well,
in fact, some of my editors can't really even stomach to look at a lot of my pictures, and I've had arguments on going the other way that no, it's important to show
the extreme lengths of stuff.
I mean, you can't sugarcoat war. Of course, there are ways of photographing that you don't have to show the most
horrific
bloody scene, but I mean, sometimes it is what it is, and I don't think we should be forced
or censored in a sense.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think what you're pointing out here is also interesting when it comes to the artistic part of conflict photography. A lot of times, you could show a horrific photo, a visual documentation of what is out there, which is war is a horrible thing. Anybody who is pro-war or, like encouraging a certain conflict, it's probably because they've never seen it. It's probably because they don't know what it actually means to go to war. But something you said earlier that I think is very interesting, and it's very much related to, again, the art of photography, is that a lot of times a horrific scene would be powerful, but sometimes even a simple moment could be even more so.
Right.
Where you can actually get to look into the eyes of a person. That affects a lot of people. Because a lot of times that's something that kind of...
Exactly.
We can understand that.
I once had a woman in Hawaii call me because she saw the cover of Amnesty International, which featured a photograph of Iraqi refugee child who was suffering from cancer. I photographed her in Jordan, and it's a very simple portrait. There's no blood. The child wasn't crying, and she said, "How can she?" She went through all the trouble of finding my phone number and called me and said, this child reminds me of my granddaughter. What can I do to help? So yes, what you're saying is it's really important that people connect.
And people do. I'm always surprised just how common that is, where a person sees a portrait or a photo from a project of something absolutely different from anything he knows. It could be, again, a war zone, or it could be a culture that's far away in the Amazon. And people always relate to the human aspects of those portraits. I can't recall exactly the name of the person, but I remember so many stories, and my favorite stories is the time where I did my first presentation of a project. My first ever project was in Mongolia. It was with eagle hunters. And I remember I was like so excited about it. I love anthropology and I love the stories, and I'm showing the images, and I'm super excited about to talk how they train their eagles and everything. And I remember that the first comment I got from somebody from the audience was a woman came up and she said, "I don't understand anything about eagle hunting, but this boy really reminds me of my son, and I'm extremely proud of him. And I think what you're discussing now in terms of portraiture and working with people.
And this woman wasn't from Mongolia, right?
Not at all.
But
She was
that's
from the
what I
UK.
was trying to say earlier. Like, there's, no matter where we're from, no matter even our differences economically, there is something that does connect us all.
We do, right? We react to people.
And let's face it, I mean, even all the money in the world is not going to buy someone's health if someone's dying of cancer.
Well, was it? I forgot who said it, but no amount of money ever bought a second.
Right.
But yeah, most definitely so. And if we actually follow up on that thought about spending time, you spend a considerable amount of time in the field. And also, if you're not in the field, based on what you said before, you always have to be tuned in. So I would assume there's big parts of your life and time that is invested into your work. And you have 2 children. You've recently 3 children, and you recently became a grandmother as well. That must have been a lot to juggle, a lot to handle.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that experience of doing these? Again, if we're talking about contrast, which I think it seems to be like kind of the theme for this podcast, where we spend a whole week in again a place that's very hard to even comprehend how difficult and challenging it is, then going back to spending time with your son or daughter.
Well, I think it probably would have actually been easier if I was, for the most part, actually flying somewhere and coming back from a distant place instead of
Hopping in
just
for a couple hours.
crossing a checkpoint and coming back, or covering a suicide bombing 10 minutes, 15 minutes away from home, and having to come back into the house and all of a sudden like find myself in the kitchen. And then also at the same time, I need to file my pictures now that technology has changed. It used to be that I would bring my films to the cargo area of the airport after going to the censor, and then they would ship it to Paris, and they would take care of everything. It's quite different now when we're doing...
Everything has to be digitalized.
Right.
Within 5 minutes,
Right.
sends a couple of photos.
It's quite difficult to walk in the door and all of a sudden, like, not bring the emotions of what I witnessed into the home. Now, my children were born here, so they're also very aware of the conflict, and in many ways also very scared. I know that my daughter Dana has a very tough time with my work, and she's a grown woman and a mother of 2 children now, but we recently had a lot of arguments about it, and I know it's hard on my children. I mean, when I was in Libya, it was the first time I actually lied, and I told her that she said, "Well, you're not going into Libya." I said, "No, I'll stay on the border and cover the refugee crisis on the Egyptian side," and I lied because I knew how much I had upset her, and you know, how do you hide from your kids? Well, you know, all of a sudden things are in reverse. Usually it's the kids hiding things from their mother. Well, I couldn't be on Facebook. I couldn't post anything because she would see it, right? So
just to keep her calm, you rather...
Yeah. And I had to make a lot of compromises too. And when I went to Syria, my son gave me an ultimatum. You're going for 2 weeks and that's it. Otherwise, you know, I'm not going to talk to you. And I know that his roommate at college told me that he was crying himself to sleep. I mean, and he was an adult. So I think it's actually harder on the kids now that they're older than when
they were younger and didn't necessarily comprehend.
Yeah.
Actually, I mean, and I think, you know, in a sense, I think it's a beautiful, if we go back to everything we talked so far. And I wanted to ask you this question, which might put you in an uncomfortable situation. I'm sorry if it did. Mm-hmm. But you've been talking a lot, and we both did, about how we all have the same needs and fears and hopes as humans. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times where people think, you know, a professional photographer must have such an exciting and beautiful life.
No, it can be very lonely.
It can be very lonely. It can be very difficult. And the kind of struggles you're describing now, I would assume a lot of people who have professional careers have them, Do I spend, working until late so I can get that member senior in the law firm I'm working in?
And I think also, I've seen my colleagues, one particular colleague, Marco Langaro from AFP, we were together in Libya and we were with the rebels and we were on a road and he was on a satellite phone listening to his son play his musical instrument because he wanted to show us, he wanted to share it with his father. So, it's not just only hard on women who have children. And I think it's quite difficult for men as well.
I think in general...
I think maybe it's more acceptable. Men are, people tend to accept a man that's in that kind of situation, covering that more so than me. I've had even male colleagues scream at me saying, "Oh, what are you doing here? You're a mother of 3 children." Well, they're not screaming at the New York Times journalist who just had a newborn baby at home. So for sure, I think society, it does not exactly view us as equal.
Well, I don't know. To be honest, when I sat down, because I knew I would want to talk to you again, and I remember the podcast we had, I was really trying to avoid the idea of saying, you're a female photographer. It's probably more difficult for you. And I might have come across as such. But what I think is, based on everything that I know from you and the occupation in general, the struggles we have are the same, whether we are men or women. We are all afraid. We all might feel lonely. We might feel insecure about our future. Because basically being a freelancer is being insecure about your future. And I think, society-wise, it is accepted from some reason.
I know a lot of men who have worked covering war and conflict, and once they had children, they said, "Okay, I have to.
I'm done.
Because you have to be prepared for the fact that you may not come back." And I've watched my colleagues on the border in Gaza literally pray. My Palestinian colleagues from Gaza before the clashes begin, because and many have told me they don't sleep the night before because there is a reality. You may not come home. And the night before is a very emotional, especially when you know that the next day you're going to be covering something very violent and something very risky. It's you almost go through this very spiritual, I don't even know how to describe it, but you even want to speak with your ex-husband.
That's a bottom
about the kids. It's something I'm not religious, and I looked at my colleagues, and it's just really powerful. It's a moment that I actually wish that I was, because you need something
to keep you there, keep you grounded.
Yeah.
Having a reason to come back.
But it's just, it is scary, and it doesn't matter how many times you do it. I'll never tell someone I'm not scared. I am.
I think it's part of your honesty, isn't it?
And I think it's also okay to come to terms with yourself when you feel that, no, you know what? I'm done for the day. You know what? And that's it. Or you just go with your instinct. Something doesn't feel right. Just don't feel ashamed to stop what you're doing and say, you know what? I'm out of here.
Be in tune with what you feel.
Yeah, because the instincts are really there to protect you, and not to feel ashamed of in front of your colleagues that you don't have the same courage at that moment. Because how do you measure courage? I think it's also really courageous to be able to say, I've had enough, and no, I'm not gonna push myself any further.
I think it's true. I think the idea of listening to your gut instinct. When you work in something like what you do, which is extremely dangerous and very, very rough, your gut instincts could protect you, and also is being in tune with what you do. But I think also in general, when you choose a career path or something you want to work on or get interested in, a lot of time it should come from there, from the same place where something is calling me there, something is leading me this way.
It is a calling.
It is. And that's
Right?
something I wanted to ask you. Like, how did you get to a place where this is what you wanted to do or end up doing?
It just happened, really. I mean, I always knew I wanted to do something that involved helping people. I was not, I was always kind of going against the grain in life. I had my first front page when I was 3 years old because I climbed into a cage of a dog during a dog show, and then the Boston Globe photographer photographed me, and I ended up on the front page. So maybe it was destiny from then.
It sounds like a troublemaker may become photographer, kind of.
It's just, I don't know exactly. It just happened, and I call it a calling. And sometimes I wish I could shut it off.
You know what? I don't think that necessarily is the case with you, because being able to wishing to shut it off, because we had a bunch of conversations. This is one of the first one I can actually share with people. And something about you is a calling. It's exactly as you said. It's in a sense where you seem to be doing things because they matter to you. And you seem to be interested and drawn to things that are important for you. And for people at home who have seen your portfolio, for example, you can really see in your photos that you take those images not because they're pretty, or not just because they were out there.
A lot of people have said that a lot of my images, even though they're very tough situations, are somehow still beautiful.
Because it's the way you see it. That's what I would say. And I think you said something that I found extremely beautiful, again, just before we started this podcast, but I think you talked about it as well. You seem to be drawn to moments. And it seems to be the reason why in those even high risk, high conflict places, you seem to be able to attract yourself to them, whether that be a very intimate moment that you had the sensitivity to photograph and work with, or just noting, that the photographer in the day before is sharing with the group just his son playing a musical instrument. Those are beautiful moments. And just before we started this podcast, you told me that somebody asked you what was your favorite 3 photos of this year, and one of them was a photograph of
the birth of my own grandchild, and I'm not sure my daughter will let me share it publicly, but even though it's not very graphic at all, it's the way
I don't know if it's the graphic or just the fact that you seem to be able to deal with those contrast of states because you're drawn to moments, whether it be extremely painful and sad, or whether it be unbelievably beautiful and enlightening.
Yeah.
I think in a sense that is something that you do both as a photographer, as an individual. So I would assume even if you weren't end up becoming a photographer, you would probably do something in that world. And it's very...
I am drawn to moments, and I'm a very emotional person. And I'm not afraid really to show it, or to be affectionate, or to hug somebody at a funeral that's a stranger, because I feel that that person could use a hug, or a child could use a hug, or... when I was in Lesbos, I was photographing the refugees arriving in the middle of the night, and it was very chaotic and a lot of commotion. And I saw a young girl that lost her family, like, for that moment, and I just put my cameras down and hugged her, because I couldn't, my problem is I do imagine myself on the other side, or I do imagine that could be my child. So I would want someone to stop what they're doing and hug them and help them find their mother. The camera doesn't shield me emotionally in any way. I've never felt like I'm a fly on the wall. I know there's a lot of debate about whether we should be, we shouldn't be. But for me, I'm always imagining that, and often grateful that I am not that mother on the other side. Yeah, because it could always happen to any of us.
And we would never see it coming. I think it's one of everybody that I ever talked to or heard of his stories, whether that be in documentaries, or my own dad who grew up in World War II. They never saw it coming. They always said, "Oh, it won't be us. It won't come here." And it could easily be. And I think what you're saying now basically can be summed up to one word, which is honesty. You don't do this kind of work, and I think most photographers who excel in it don't do it because they want to become famous. They don't do it because that's the only thing they want to do, or they found financial future in it. They do it because it's important to them, and they are honest about it, and they're honest about what they are trying to convey and push forward with their work. And we're almost out of time for this podcast, so I want to ask you one last thing. Sure. When I started this podcast, when I started doing this series of conversations, I had a goal in mind to create a series of talks, of topics that I wish I could hear 10 years ago when I first started. I mean, for you, it's probably quite a long time ago, but people at home are listening to you right now. And if we're talking about being honest and so on, what would you say would be the most important thing for people to understand about the art of photography, or would that be the line of work you do, which is more conflict and raw, working with people? What is something you wished you heard when you first started, when you first approached this field of photography in general?
I think, first of all, I would say it's also really important to explore stories in your own backyard. You don't necessarily have to get on a plane to work on compelling stories. I think we all tend to overlook what's going on in our own backyard. I think it's important to learn about the people, learn the story, research. I mean, it's so much different today. I mean, we have the internet. We have so much more information at our fingertips compared to what we had
almost nothing ago.
Yeah, and also safety is important. I mean, I think we should all take first aid courses. You don't need it in a war zone. I've used it on the highway from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. So you never know when you could really be of use to someone in need. So, I would say research, go out and do it. Don't wait for someone to assign you, because I think 90% of my work, published work, was work that was self-initiated and not assigned. So
be honest, be curious,
yes, and never
safe.
compromise the ethics of photojournalism or the ethics of humanity.
I think that's a beautiful thing, and I think it's a very powerful approach to anything, whether that be photography or business or whatever it is you want to do in life. And I hope people at home take that to heart. Heidi, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you again. Really, it's a great honor. Before
we finish, people at home who might be interested of checking out your work or following up on things that you do, is there any way, how is best to kind of do that?
You can Google me, Photo by Heidi Levine, my website at www.heidilevine.com.
Anyway, we're going to do in the blog post, you're going to see a bunch of photos of your portfolio, and we're going to put links to the website. Okay. I don't think you have an Instagram account, do you?
I do.
You do, so we'll put the Instagram account first, because it has to be out there. Beautiful work. Please keep doing the work that you do. For people at home, if you're ever interested of seeing an amazingly powerful set of images, do check out this work, the body of work. And I hope you keep at it, because you're unbelievably talented. And I had a pleasure of sitting here and talking to you again.
Thank you.
So thank you so much. That will be the end of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.